Hello, fabulous listeners. Thanks for tuning in to All Bodies Outside. This is your host, Dr. Brian Peterson. I am thrilled for this episode because we have Dr. Janae Davis joining us. She works at American Rivers and is the Southeast Conservation Director. Dr. Davis's work promotes the health of rivers and riverside lands to ensure clean drinking water supply, reduce flood risks, protect biodiversity, and ensure sustainable and equitable access to conservation decision-making for communities of color. As a social scientist, she seeks to understand how to effectively promote justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in biodiversity conservation. You can check out more about American Rivers at americanrivers.org. And during this episode, we'll talk some more about American Rivers, and we'll also discuss a manuscript published by Dr. Davis that is titled Black Faces, Black Spaces, Rethinking African American Underrepresentation in Wildland Spaces and Outdoor Recreation. Dr. Davis, it is a pleasure to have you on All Bodies Outside.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So where are you connecting in from?
From beautiful Charlotte, North Carolina.
Oh, yeah. Nice. And is spring kind of getting going in Charlotte?
Yes, the red buds are blooming. The red buds are kind of our first indicator that spring is coming. So they're blooming and I'm so excited. And it's about almost 70 degrees today. So.
Oh, wow. Nice. Yeah. That's fantastic. Heck yeah. Have you seen any changing of any bird populations coming through that are migrating to maybe warmer areas?
Definitely. I have not been, but what I hear is a lot of birds these days, but I cannot identify them because
nice.
I
did my PhD at Clemson, and I'm a very novice birder, but I really enjoyed the birds of the Southeast. So sorry to fling that question on you not being a birder, but it was something
good.
Yeah, before I moved to the Southeast, I didn't really pay attention to birds, and I was like, they're pretty. They got a lot of colors. They got a lot of variety to them. But it was when I was living in the Southeast that I really came to enjoy their presence.
Yeah, and the Southeast is a biodiversity hotspot, especially along our Appalachian areas where you were, or our mountainous areas where you were in Clemson, and so that does not surprise me at all. It's a beautiful, beautiful place for birds. So.
Yeah, and I loved living there. It was great to be in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains and just a lot of wonderful forests. I miss the forests a lot.
Yeah. Well, come on back down.
Yeah, I know. I got it. Well, let's get this conversation going today. And so first off, I just wanted to hear about American Rivers. I talked about in the introduction, but let's just hear, what is American Rivers? When did it get started? It's a nonprofit, right?
Okay,
it
is a nonprofit. Yeah. American Rivers is a national nonprofit advocacy environmental organization. We started in 1973 as a response to the Wild and Scenic Act. It was a piece of legislation that was passed in the early 70s. And what we found is that a lot of the legislation was passed, but there was no movement in designating actual wild and scenic rivers. And so the organization was started by a few folks who are interested in getting wild and scenic river designations, more wild and scenic designations going all over the country. And so since then, we've evolved. We're an organization somewhere between 80 to 95 staff across the country.
Wow.
And our mission is to, protect wild rivers, to restore damaged rivers, and to conserve clean water for people and nature. And we do that through what we call land conservation, protecting land. We do that by restoring places that have been damaged, especially along our river corridors. And we we protect clean water. So we get a lot involved in a lot of EPA issues. We get involved in a lot of issues, especially locally regarding stormwater, wastewater, drinking water, and so and we do a lot of hydropower work as well. So we do all kinds of work all over the country related to rivers, and it's a wonderful organization to work for, indeed.
Yeah, it does sound wonderful.
Yeah.
I got to imagine that the staff is comprised of a lot of different skill sets. Like, probably, like, do you have some lawyers on staff to help with some of this EPA stuff?
Yes, we have general counsel. She's terrific. We have folks who are very technical oriented, folks who are biologists, social scientists like myself, people who specialize in political science and the policy realm. And so we are a very diverse organization. In terms of our knowledge base, for sure. And that's what it takes, because our issues these days, they're not, I guess, what we call disciplinary, right? Like, we need all hands on deck and all skills to address the multiple crises of our time. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, it sounds like that multifaceted variety of skills is necessary for all these complex issues that are going on that involve the environment, involve people. So that sounds fantastic, what American Rivers is up to. And so just to hear a little bit more about American Rivers, what types of projects are you currently pursuing in the Southeast region?
Yeah, in the Southeast region, I wear several hats these days at American Rivers. I work on dam removal work in specifically North Carolina and South Carolina. I work with a slew of partners from Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, our state EPA agencies, from also other nonprofits and local governments to forward dam removals. And this is an important issue because most of our dams throughout the country actually are obsolete. And the life span of a dam is somewhere around 50 years or so. And when you consider that, and the fact that most dams in the U.S. were built in the early 1900s or even the late 1800s, a lot of those dams they're obsolete, they're not in use, and they're clogging up our waterways. And those have climate implications, it has public safety implications, it has biodiversity implications. And so I work to forward our dam removal work in the Carolinas. Now, in terms of river conservation or land protection, or what we call riverside land protection, I do that work for the Southeast more broadly. Right now, I'm engaged in several projects. The first one is to create a river protection plan for the whole Southeast, because we don't have one yet.
Whoa.
But yeah.
It's a bit, I said, whoa, more so towards it's a big undertaking just to put together a Southeast region plan.
Yeah. So it's, I'm looking forward to it, though. It's gearing up for it at the moment and having some really great conversations with our staff and our partners. Right now, I'm also involved in a pilot project with the Aldo Leopold Institute with Clemson University, your alma mater.
Nice.
Yeah. And we've partnered with the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service to better understand how to make federally designated wilderness more accessible for African Americans. And we're piloting this project in South Carolina, but the idea is to hopefully make this, hopefully to create a broader framework that could support equity and access across the nation as a whole. So yeah, that's kind of my work right now in the Southeast region. And then I also co-lead our national river protection work. You'll find that this is the nonprofit world. It's not just me, it's everywhere. You have people who are wearing multiple hats doing good work. But I co-lead our national river protection work to support and promote river protection across our organization and across the country at large. And so, Yes. So it's a
Yeah.
lot, but I enjoy, I love what I do. I enjoy. It's very meaningful work.
Yeah, well, thanks for all the meaningful work you do. It sounds wonderful. But I did have a question about the dam removal projects. Does American Rivers ever partner with Patagonia? And I'm just going off of, their
Hmm.
documentary Damnation.
Hmm. That would be a question for our communications team and the lead of our dam team. I wouldn't be surprised if we do
Yeah.
partner with Patagonia, but I can get that information for you for sure.
Okay. Well, let's transition into the manuscript that I mentioned in the introduction. I'll just say that title again. Your manuscript, Black Faces, Black Spaces, Rethinking African American Underrepresentation in Wildland Spaces and Outdoor Recreation. And so, as we kind of get into your manuscript here, I wanted to open that conversation up with what led you to researching justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Oh yes, it's a long story. I think you know the I think my love of the environment goes back to you know just growing up in the South in a urban area, but that urban area that had a lot of nature throughout, and we would ride our bikes and we would have picnics by stream sides and that kind of thing. And when I was about 10 years old, I got into reggae music. And if you listen to reggae music, it's all about justice and equity, and especially when it comes down to racial justice. And that became like being so young and ingesting those lyrics, ingesting that energy, it shaped my brain. It shaped the way I see the world. Literally, I think forever. Um, and so my whole outlook was, even as I, went through high school. I was known as like, everybody called me like Mrs. Malcolm X kind of thing, and going into college, going into my undergrad, I was always focused on issues of justice and
Wow.
equity and the environment as well. But the environment was more of a hobby thing. It wasn't at that point. It wasn't really a something that I actually studied. I was an anthropology, sociology major, but yeah, that's how it came from reggae music and artists like Bob Marley and Peter Tosh and Steel Pulse and all our reggae artists for sure. So that's how that's what framed it for me. But I will say that I so after I completed my undergrad, I joined a reggae band. I've lived about 10 different lives at this point, but
All right,
I
so
joined.
Janae, what instruments do you play?
I played keyboards and I did vocals as well. Yeah,
No
yeah.
way. Gosh. Okay, we need to have a whole episode about that.
Yeah. We can have a whole. That was a. There's. I have stories galore, so we can come
Yeah,
back to
that's
that.
so cool.
Yeah, but yeah, I joined a reggae band, and then there was this kind of interlude between my undergrad and going back to school for my master's. It was about a 10-year gap. But when I went back to school and I decided to go back to school, I did want to integrate the environment, my love of nature, and also my concern for issues of justice and equity. I wanted to integrate those and find you know um, an academic path, but also a career path that would allow me to um, integrate those and pursue those issues, the issues that I really cared about. And this was, I would say, on the eve of me going back to school, being admitted to University of South Carolina. I was walking my dog in a nature preserve right around the corner from me. And at that point, like I was thinking about a master's project that will honor my Native American heritage. So my great grandmother was a Native American, and so I was like, I want to do something that honor my Native American heritage. But when I went to this preserve, I had an encounter with two white women. To make a long story short, they released their dog on me.
Oh.
Yeah, and thank goodness I had my dog, and the two dogs got in a fight, and um, but I ended up being injured in that encounter. Um, and I started thinking about how, as a Black woman, being in nature is risky. It's not, it's not a safe space. And thinking about, lynching, thinking about rape, thinking about our history as a people in nature, it is not the happiest of histories. And so I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about, like my response to that, though, because the physical wounds healed within a week or two, but the emotional, mental wounds took a lot more time to heal. But my response that I came to the conclusion is that, I am not going to let this beat me. I'm not going to let this turn me into, a negative person or a bitter person. And I'm not going to sit here and be depressed and pitiful over it either. The best way I can honor my ancestors is to make the outdoors a safer and equitable place. So I came to this project with Congaree National Park, my master's project, through that process of healing from that incident in the park. Yeah, that was my response. It was a rebellious response, and it felt good. Yeah.
Yeah, gosh, Janae, you just covered so much. I was thinking about the power of music. I had no clue that you had Native American ancestry. And then, being attacked by this dog. And I really appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that. And I also appreciate that, the way that you saw it was, this needs to be something that serves my ancestors, serves people going forward for better and more equitable access. And, the sad thing about it is those stories are not uncommon. Not uncommon at all. I had another guest on here, Dr. Akibia Hicks, who is soon to be graduating out of Clemson, and she worked for the National Park Service. And when she first started working at the National Park Service, very early on, she had her uniform on, she's driving in, and a car was approaching her and stopped there was a 2-lane road, stopped her, kind of pulled in front of her perpendicularly, stopped her and said, "Black people don't work at the National Park Service." And like there's a lot of emotional trauma with that. Like, yes, the physical wounds for you healed, but the emotional trauma that sticks. And I'm glad to hear that you're taking action with it, and you're being continue to be inspired by the power of music too, and doing wonderful things for this world. And I love that you have the really rich academic background, but you're doing it also in a practical sense and helping out American rivers and doing what you can with the Jedi movement. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So that is fantastic. I appreciate your explanation there. There was a lot to that, and it's not a small question. What led you to researching justice, equity, diversity, inclusion? There's a lot to that. So I appreciate you touching on all those different points that led you to your career. Yeah, okay. So your research for this manuscript took place at Congaree National Park, which is in South Carolina. Probably most of the visitors have not been to Congaree National Park. So what is Congaree currently like, and what was it like before it became federally protected land?
Yeah, Congaree today, it's a really interesting place to me, because the first time I ever went there, it wasn't too far from where I lived at the time in South Carolina. And it's, situated right in the heart of South Carolina, in the Midlands, south of the state capital, which is Columbia. And the first time I went there, I noticed that, like, it was sitting like right in the middle of an African American community, and I was like, what is the relationship here? Because a lot of times when we think about national parks, we don't think about it being situated, number one, so close to an urban area, and number two, in an African American community. And so today, that's where it's situated as well. Um, it's, it's at the time of my research, it was a little over 27,000 acres of land, what we call bottomland hardwood forest. You have the Congaree River that flows through it on one edge, and then the Watery River that flows on the other edge, and the Cedar Creek that flows. It's a beautiful area. Um, and much of it is a repair. There's riparian areas, what we call riverine areas, but there are also uplands as well. And it's managed by a pretty small staff of National Park Service folks. And I would say today, they're and we're involved in a project with them. And I think this is maybe an implication of the research that I did, partly the implication of a research that I did, but it's been going on for a while. Congaree National Park is a UN biosphere reserve.
Right.
And so and to be a biosphere reserve requires extensive community engagement between the park, the surrounding community, state governments, and as well as local governments. And so today the park is really involved with the community, the local community and the broader community. They're still, I think, trying to build out that local community partnership after so many years and decades of I think exclusion, and I can go into that as well. But they're trying to repair that. I think they're sincerely trying to repair that relationship. And so, yeah, that's the park today. I would say before federal wilderness was implemented at the park, and that was in around 2003 when the park was designated. It was first a national monument, and I think that was in 1988. It was designated a national monument. In 2003, it was designated a national park, and that's when all the wilderness management was created and implemented, and folks start to see their access to the park eroding. But before that, that area was a commons, what we understand as a commons. So it was dominated by, folks who owned land, private land. And a lot of this land came into the hands of African American community through the land redistribution process that happened during the Reconstruction era. So, right after emancipation, a lot of both men and women were able to purchase property in this area. And a lot of folks have held on to that property even till today. And so, and we had a lot of white residents in that area as well, even though it was predominantly African American. And, it was an area which is really interesting, even between the Black residents and the white residents from my interviews with folks, is that folks did not mind if you crossed over their land. They didn't mind if you hunted on their land. They didn't mind if you fished on their land. It was a commons, and even white people were cool with that. When we consider Jim Crow and the South in general, this particular area managed to, at least in the area of land tenure and land access. Land access. It was a pretty positive energy. And so, in this community is called Lower Richland. Lower Richland means it's south Richland County, but they call it Lower Richland. In this area, there weren't a ton of jobs for African Americans. What was explained to me is that you either worked at the Army base at Fort Jackson, or you did kind of little, little odd jobs here and there. And so a lot of families relied on subsistence practices, hunting, fishing, and foraging in this commons area to survive. And so that's what it was like. And before that, if we go back even further, it was an area that was um, inhabited or dominated by Native Americans who are called the Congaree.
Ah,
Yeah, and from what I understand, they were kind of a smaller population, but they lived along the river, um, and but they were wiped out due to smallpox when the colonizers arrived in South Carolina, and so um, a lot of them passed away, and the land itself was taken over by plantation owners. And the
mm,
plantation owners, they were growing, I think, indigo for a minute there. I can't remember what other crops. Oh, and they were livestock. They were cattle farming, and so this area, for much of the year, this area is inundated during the wet season, which is the winter season, is inundated with water. And so what you had was a lot of they called them cowboys. They were enslaved folks who were cowboys, and they raise livestock, they raise cattle there. And even today, if you go to the park, there are areas called cattle mounds that were built by
mm,
enslaved people. And what those mounds do is that the cowboys would round them up, during the wet season, and they would round them up on these cattle mounds, and the cattle would wait out, the flooding throughout the winter season on these mounds. And so, and there was also a maroon community in what is now the park as well, on one of the islands in the river. And so it's a very storied place that we don't
yeah.
hear too much. But at this moment, the park is like a lot of national park units across the country. They're looking to tell those stories of the
Good.
history of the land.
Good.
Yeah,
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 there's a lot of stories ingrained in Congaree National Park, and that was a wonderful explanation. You touched on a lot of stuff, and we all learned why it's called Congaree National Park. I did not know that, so
yeah.
thanks for that. And it's quite a storied history, though. There's a lot that's gone on there. Today, for if people were to go there, I've been there only once, but what I remember is it's kind of swampy, and there's some boardwalks that you can walk on throughout the
Mm-hmm.
main part of the park. That was kind of my memory of Congaree. I went camping there. Oh gosh, probably spring of 2019. Definitely was before COVID, and it was a fun little visit. And it was actually a grad student camping trip between Clemson and NC State, North Carolina State. And so I got to
Ooh,
meet some fellow grad students. That was kind of fun.
yeah.
But yeah, well, that was a wonderful history. So thanks for sharing all those details, Janae. I really appreciate it. Okay, continuing on. I was reading through your research manuscript in preparation for our conversation today, and in your manuscript, you give a little bit of background on the Wilderness Act. And so I wanted to, just touch on, what are some of the basic tenets of the Wilderness Act, and what types of assumptions are embedded in the Wilderness Act?
Yeah, the Wilderness Act, and it's the Wilderness Act of 1964. And that 64 is like, we think about what was going on in 1964, right? We had the civil rights movement, and at the same time, we had this environmental movement, what we call the modern day environmental movement, that was growing as well. And I think that at that time when the act was created and passed, it really adopted a lot of um, the understandings of what a pristine environment should look like um, at that time in 1964. And one of the things that I really think about as well, and if you read Carolyn Finney's book, Black Spaces, White Spaces, she makes this point as well, is that we think about the Wilderness Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act was passed also in 1964. This is there's a theory that when we pass legislation, sometimes what happens is that this legislation is being built in response to something else. And I think the argument probably could be made that the Wilderness Act of 1964 in some ways was a response to the civil rights movement, you know, giving people the idea of, especially for African Americans, increasing rights for African Americans to live in freedom. I think some of that I don't know. I wonder if there's a pushback here, because the Wilderness Act of 1964, it number one sets the stage of what a wilderness area is. And basically a wilderness area, and it's going, it's adopting these tenets, these principles and values from the earlier environmental movement that kind of kicked off in the mid 1800s. But it privileges leisure, or what we call non-consumptive leisure that doesn't leave a trace on the landscape. So we hear about leave no trace, right? So we're talking about scenic viewing, we're talking about hiking, and we're talking about canoeing, and we're talking about these versus hunting and fishing and those types of practices, right? And so, but wilderness privileges these non-consumption leisure practices. Also, when you read the act, it also privileges scenic viewing. It privileges intellectual pursuits such as research and science. And when you think about, for African Americans, like, there is a completely different history and relationship with the environment that is not included here. Leisure in nature, going to a forest to just look around, and to walk around, and science and education, which a lot of African Americans were barred from a lot of our scientific and educational institutions leading up to this point. And so, so it sets up this tenets, and then it talks about how wilderness is an area where man comes but doesn't stay. So we have a gender divide there as well. But it also leaves out, the practices of Native Americans, because it already says that wilderness is a space where you don't live, and it completely ignores that history of Native American presence on the land. And so, and also, so because it sets it up this way, it then goes into these tenets that says, okay, a wilderness area is a space for these activities, and therefore you can't have any roads, you can't have any motorized vehicles, you can't have any mechanical vehicles, no structures, or no signage unless it's deemed necessary for wilderness management. And so if you think about this piece of legislation and these mandates being implemented in a space where people are hunting, fishing, and foraging,
right?
Like, that's going to displace a lot of folks' traditional ecological practices, and also a lot of these practices, especially in Lower Richland, that folks weren't getting. They were tied to their culture. It was one of the biggest ways that they built community and maintained community. And so, with the the designation of the park and the gazetting of the area for the entire park is not federal designated wilderness, but a good chunk of it is. And a lot of those folks who were practicing those ecological, I say cultural, ecological, social practices out there, they were completely displaced when wilderness management was implemented in the park.
Yeah, it sounds like, going back to that positive kind of community around the commons in Lower Lower Richland, right? And
Hmm.
that seems like that just got wiped away with the Wilderness Act and completely displaced them, and didn't really realize, like, did not even include that these practices are, a great way for people to interact with the environment, also to conserve the environment too. I mean, they care about the environment. Their livelihood is based on the environment. They want to see their fishing holes thrive.
Hmm.
They're big time conservationists, and for them to get displaced, it seems kind of backwards.
It was backwards. And the interesting thing about that, and I totally agree with you, is that number one, and I think, folks like William Cronin, he's
Mm-hmm.
a big influence in the way I thought about this project. But he talks about how, when you separate people from the environment, it doesn't give them a knowledge base or motivation or impetus, inspiration to conserve the environment, to understand how to live with nature. But also, it can be damaging to the ecology as well. One of the things we saw at Congaree is that because, especially for fisher folks, because wilderness limited fishing, you ended up with a lot of people fishing in a few areas. And so that exhausted certain areas of what we call Cedar Creek and the river itself. And so it was, from that, you can think about like, this is actually kind of damaging to the environment, even though the intention was to preserve the environment, and preserve it from human influence. It kind of had, it kind of had an opposite effect. So,
Well, I think it's that type of effect that gets you thinking, like, was this some sort of reaction to the civil rights movement?
hmm exactly.
Yeah, I could
Hmm.
see those hypotheses getting going real quick, just because of that seems totally backwards. This displaced a positive community around the commons, which was just thriving and doing great. People are looking after each other. I gotta imagine if you had too many fish, then you probably threw a cookout and had a party for people to come and enjoy the fish and the
Yeah,
food and whatnot, because there wasn't a lot of jobs in the area and whatnot. You needed to rely on the land for fishing and hunting.
exactly. Exactly. And that's exactly what they did. And that's what folks talked about, historically before 2000. This is very recent. This was before
Really
2003. They were able to go out there, and they talked about the folks that I interviewed, the residents in the area. They talked about having, going fishing and then having a big fish fry, right at, and some of them still do that actually.
good.
But fishing is, um, at that point when I was doing the research, fishing was limited and it wasn't happening as often. But fish fries, gifting people would, for elders, who didn't have the physical capacity to continue to go out there and fish themselves, they would fish for the elders and take them fish. Like it was really a way of, um, maintaining community. I mean, there were like fishing, like a lot of folks talked about, there being like a fishing days, and it's usually on the weekends, and like family and friends would just go out, to their favorite fishing hole. At that time they were able to drive out there or ride a bike out there, what have you. And they were able to, you dig for your bait out there, you could cook out there, so they would spend the whole day out there. A lot of folks would camp out there. But under the Wilderness Act, like, you can't dig for bait in a
Mhm.
wilderness area. You can't, um, make a fire and cook in a wilderness
Right.
area. You can't drive your car because the park is huge. The area is huge. So if you can't ride your bike or drive out there, then you can't get out there anymore. And if you walk, it'll be all day, and you're carrying your fishing gear, and that's a lot of gear, and you have kids in tow, and, so yeah, the implementation of wilderness management, like what you were saying, like the fish fries and all these social activities, though it wasn't only the subsistence practices that were interrupted, it was the social and community bonding that was also interrupted as well. So agree,
Yeah.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is a lot of interruption. And, through your explanation, I just was thinking how, just thinking about physical access, how narrow that got. You can't have motorized vehicles in there anymore. You got to walk super far now to your fishing hole, and there's only a few fishing holes now, opposed to a variety, letting people spread out. And then you get your catches and whatnot, and you got to carry that out. And it's like, my gosh, like how are you gonna do this? Like it's too much. Like you need something nearby to help you out with a vehicle or something like that. And but overall though, what a shame though that community just kind of got totally displaced by that situation of the Wilderness Act coming in. Because it sounded like it was a beautiful community, and people took care of each other.
Yeah, it was, and in a lot of ways, it still is. I mean, there's a lot of um, there still is a high rate of Black land ownership. There's even a Black hunt club in the community, and so they, in a lot of ways, they found ways to navigate the displacement, using the resources and the access to land and land ownership that they have, but it's been severely diminished. And I mean, I can say the park itself is at this point trying to figure out how to rectify that. And since the research, I mean, they have loosened some restrictions on fishing and that kind of thing. And right now they're in the midst of a fishing study to better understand how the local community uses the creeks and rivers that flow through the area, and how the park can facilitate that, and facilitate these community practices, but at the same time protect the resource, which is a balance, that they're trying to figure out. So.
Yeah. Well, part of your research, you interviewed park employees, right? And so, what kind of things got illuminated in those interviews?
Yeah, that was really interesting because they were very, very, very aware of the displacement that happened,
Okay.
and they were remorseful. They were, for the most part, they understood. Number one, they understood the displacement. They recognized what happened, and they saw how it could be perceived as racism, right? And I mean, one park employee told me, it's like, well, I mean, I can see how they could perceive it that way because it felt that way to me, And so, and there was a recognition there, and there was also the recognition that that wilderness management, and the federal government and the mandates that they had to implement and comply by, those took precedence, and yeah, and one of the things that was, one of the barriers that they were facing, in the National Park Service, you kind of climb the ranks by switching to different park units every couple of years, and so no one is ever really there. I can say no one, because there are some folks who've been there for a long time, but for a lot of staff and at Congaree, I would say most of the staff, like most of those folks, weren't there in 2003. And most of those folks either just came on, a lot of those folks just came on, and some of them are about to roll off, and go to another unit. And so, even though maybe the will was there, to bring justice, in this situation, to rectify the situation, folks just weren't there long enough to gain the traction to actually do the work. I think there's a more concerted effort to do that in spite of the barrier now. So we'll see how that works out. But but they explained that they're just barriers in the way the Park Service runs anyway, to bring about a just resolution. And also, one of the things, and this is one of the things that we're researching in our pilot study, which includes Congaree National Park, is one of those, is the national park unit that we're looking at with this wilderness study that we have going on right now is that, there are accommodations made for indigenous communities, that are written in statutes and policies for how the park operates and engages local communities. But if you don't have indigenous status, and especially federal indigenous status, you kind of left out. You're there's no framework for the park to work with you. And so that's another thing that I think African American, but other communities of color, and also state recognized tribes or tribes that are not even recognized. That we have in the South, we have tribes that aren't recognized at all, and so it leaves out a whole bunch of communities of color who might have had or do have some kind of interest or stake in that area, but there's no framework to work with them, and there's no mandate to work with them either. That's another thing we're trying to address. There's a ton of barriers.
A lot of barriers, and I've seen that in the Midwest too, with some of our local tribes that are unrecognized. And I was thinking of that as just a barrier in itself. Trying to gain that federal recognition, the state recognition and whatnot. And so I want to kind of tie this piece of the conversation back into a sentence in the introduction. That was that some of your work is, helping to ensure sustainable and equitable access to conservation decision-making for communities of color. And so, the National Park Service has a lot of movement around. That's how you kind of move up the ladder for, in the generalized way. Does it Congress, and you may not know this, but do they have some sort of advisory board that has local leaders of these different groups to help this process reflect the values of these communities?
Yes, now they do, and they have for a time. So the Congaree Biosphere Reserve, I think, is at this point a great vehicle for building that advisory board that you're talking about. The Congaree Biosphere Reserve has been a biosphere reserve for, I want to say, several decades now, but it's actually just being kicked off. And what biosphere reserves are these programs that are affiliated with the United Nations, and they try to. What they do, they take these, national ecological treasures in different countries. And, in South Carolina, it's Congaree National Park. And they bid to protect that particular resource in a sustainable way. The framework is to partner with community members to promote sustainable development or cultural resource preservation or sustainable economic development. So to develop the corridor to these areas in a way that's sustainable, that protects the resources. I think that's the general gist of these. So the Congaree Biosphere Reserve Initiative, it does engage that. I think the core members are the park, CIRCO, which is the Southeast Rural Community Outreach, and they're African American led nonprofit organization in Lower Richland that is dedicated to the well-being of Lower Richland. And then the Midlands Regional Council of Governments. And so those are the core members. And then you have members like myself or American Rivers and other universities and nonprofits and local governments, etc., who are, I guess, members at large who support that. So that framework is terrific. They just kicked off about a year ago in earnest. And we're still kind of just getting started, but it's really interesting and I think beneficial to really learn the different interests that are affiliated with the park, and to collectively figure out how do we incorporate justice and equity, and remedy what has been lost as well, because of wilderness management, but also because of gentrification and development. That is a whole nother issue in that region. How do we tackle all of these things concurrently in a way that promotes the well-being of the social fabric and also the ecological resources? So it's underway.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
you all are tackling a lot. That gentrification piece is a whole big piece in its own right, and I know that I don't know, but maybe is Columbia starting to expand in towards Congaree, and that's starting to price people out. Possibly, is that happening?
That is happening. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, because Congaree is only, or Lower Richland's only, maybe about a 15-20 mile drive out of the center of Columbia.
Whoa.
You can get to Congaree within maybe 20 minutes from downtown Columbia. So it's really close to this and urban sprawl is a really huge issue for the community as well. You have folks who in that area who have owned land for generations and generations. But there are folks who are not rich in that area. There are folks that property if your property value goes up, or you're putting sewage in places now where there used to be wet, those, it's going to change the landscape. It's going to change people's ability to afford to continue to live there. And then heirs property is also an issue. I don't know if you know about heirs property, but
I don't.
Heirs property is property that is handed down. In the case of African American communities, from generation to generation, a lot of African Americans who were able to purchase property during the Reconstruction era, a lot of that land is heirs property, and what that is that property that has been handed down from generation to generation without a legal will. And this problem came about through so many different means. A lot of Black folks, they just kind of hid their land, their deeds, to their properties, because they were afraid, especially during the Jim Crow era, that someone would come and steal that deed. They were, it was better to keep the fact that you own this property private. It was better to keep, in a lot of cases, the fact that you own property under wraps as a way to not bring attention to yourselves. And because what has happened, regardless, is that a lot of this property has been swindled from the hands of African Americans. You can see this down in Mississippi, where a lot of heirs property has ended up in the hands of corporations. So you have to clear the title. If you don't have a will, you have to clear that takes a legal process to do that. And we do have a really terrific organization in South Carolina that helps heirs property owners clear their title. It's called Center for Heirs Property. They're a terrific partner of ours. But I mean, that's an issue as well, because if you can't prove that you own the land, then there are all kind of legal maneuvers that can be made by either developers or even the local government to take your property. So that's a problem in the area as well. So I can keep going on and on and on. But yeah, so I mean, all of these things, in my view, will need to be addressed in tandem, in order for the community to, number one, just to continue to live there, but to also recompense for the displacement in their practices, their ecological and social practices as well, and also protect the resource, as well. So
absolutely,
got a lot to go. Yeah.
There's a lot. My gosh. Well, thanks for that explanation. And I can see how legally proving those deeds, that was something that probably wasn't desired because you just don't want to bring attention to yourself. Because during the Jim Crow era, like I'd like no attention, please, because it's probably going to be negative attention, and something negative is going to come of it. And so I hope that sensitivity and that historical horrible episode, there's sensitivity towards that.
Yeah, and there is. So we just
Good.
have to operationalize it. That's all.
Yeah, right. All right, Janae, I got a huge question for you next. What's your favorite Bob Marley album?
Ooh, wow. Oh my goodness. Oh, can I do two?
Okay, rock it. Yeah.
Okay. Uprising.
Okay.
And Survival.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, those are my two.
Uprising and Survival. So what's your favorite medium to listen to Bob Marley? Would it be, say, just like MP3, or do you prefer vinyl?
Yeah, I don't have Bob in any vinyl.
Okay.
I had tapes at one point, and then I switched over to CDs, and now I'm on my...
I've been there.
Yeah. I do miss tapes. I really do. But now I'm on Apple Music. Yeah.
Yeah. I still have my CDs. I drive a 2002 SUV, and it has a 6-disc CD changer in it. And so I get to show my kids all my high school music. But we do have Bob. We have Exodus at home that plays on vinyl. My kids, they're 11 and 12, love it. And it's beautiful music. And I'm glad. I just love that you brought that into your explanation earlier of, how you got into your research and whatnot. So I figured that'd be a fun question to end with today. Dr. Davis, you have been extremely wonderful. It's super fun to have on the show. Your explanations were really, really thorough and accessible. And I'm so thankful that you're here to deliver quality content to the listeners. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It was so great to talk to you. And I look forward to digging into the podcast even more and learning from other folks who've been on the show. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I'm full of gratitude that you joined. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to throw on that outro music and we'll call it an episode.